Okay, so I have a fun video for you guys today, and this one's going to be on how to create a real-time interior modern bedroom scene, all with Blender 2.8 and with the new render engine EEVEE that allows you to render scenes like this in real time. So let's take a look real quick. This is a scene that we'll be creating from scratch in Blender in about 30 to 35 minutes. It's one of those slightly time-lapse videos at times to just show you guys all the tips and tricks on how to create something like this without all of the extra stuff in the middle. So if you are, say, an intermediate Blender user, this should be great for you. If you've never used Blender before, you might want to check out one of my beginner videos first just to get a little bit more comfortable with Blender. But I would say that this covers everything you need to know if you've been using Blender for about a month or so. I'm really excited to share with you guys all the tips and tricks that go into creating a scene like this and rendering it in real time within Blender. So stay tuned and let's get going. Before we get started, I'd like to thank CG Trader for sponsoring this video. CG Trader is one of the largest 3D content providers available on the web and offer a great online 3D model marketplace with tons of assets available to all 3D artists and designers to upload, sell, or share their work, and offer helpful seller analytics to give historic real-time data on the 3D models available on the marketplace. They also provide an online platform for freelance 3D projects where you can find tons of great opportunities for freelance jobs or post any job you need done. You can check out CG Trader with the link in the description below. And one thing I wanted to quick mention before we get started is that it's always helpful to have a lot of reference images for the different types of scenes you might be creating before you start a project. So what I did is I scoured the Google images and found a few different designs similar to what I was looking for in my final scene, and I threw them together in a program called PureRef. It's a nice little program that was recommended to me for throwing together reference images, and you can stack them and organize them however you like. And yeah, it's a nice little program that is easy to throw on a second monitor and throw all of your reference images on. Okay, so starting off here in Blender 2.8, we're using the beta, but all versions of Blender will work great. We're just going to start off by creating a floor plane by adding in, of course, a plane with Shift A and plane. We're going to scale it up to about 6 units. I found to be a good size for this building. Then I'm just going to switch to edit mode in the edge select option and extrude the walls up, all 3 sides, up again about 4 or 5 meters. As you can see, I hit that up in the top corner. And now we're just going to duplicate the floor by grabbing the floor plane, Shift-D'ing it, and moving that up to the ceiling. Now the ceiling kind of has like a drop ceiling that I thought looked pretty cool, so I'm just going to duplicate that ceiling piece and extrude it down a little bit so we have a little bit of depth there. Now I'm going to set up a few shading options by choosing matte cap and random color for the different objects. It just makes it easier to see your different objects, as well as shadow and cavity. This just makes the viewport in EEVEE look really nice and is nice to work in for 3D modeling. So here I'm just kind of placing my camera in the general area that I'm going to be doing my scene. So I'm just going to add a cube here for that wall that you see kind of behind the bed in this scene. And I'm going to scale it up to reach the ceiling. And then of course scale it along the X and Y to get the right rectangular shape. This can always be changed later, so you don't have to be too picky about it. Now I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate that wall piece and move it behind the scene just to block off any light that we don't want coming from the back there. So here I just go ahead and add some windows. This is made by just grabbing your wall planes and hitting Y so it's a separate piece. And then I can go ahead and go Control R, put 2 loops in for the edges of my window, and then Control R again for the edges of the window, and then you can go Control R again for the top and bottom. And this again can always be changed. You can see here I'm just kind of grabbing that face now and extruding it out. Now you can delete the face and you're left with a nice little windowsill. This is the process for both the windows that I put into the scene, as you can see here. And now it's just a matter of kind of moving things around until you like the dimensions you're getting. You could use a reference image. I'm not going to bother doing it here. As you can see, you can always grab things like the windows and stuff and slide them along, just hitting G twice or just grabbing along the X or Y axis. Alright, so here I'm going ahead and adding in the bed for the scene. This is kind of the main subject of this scene, I would say. And again, it's just a basic cube scaled into place and put down onto the floor. Now I'm just going ahead and adding a few edge loops to kind of tighten up those corners to make it look a little bit more like a mattress. Again, you can slide these edge loops by double tapping G or just grabbing it and moving along the axis. I'm going to go ahead here and smooth it by just hitting F3 and typing shade smooth. And I went up to 3 subdivisions on this mesh. So now I'm just going to duplicate it and use it for the top mattress. So that was kind of the bed frame. This is going to be more of the mattress, just slightly smaller and a little bit different in the proportions. I'm going to jump into edit mode here then and kind of add a few more edge loops to the mattress and to the bed frame just to kind of get the shape I'm looking for. If it's too sharp, you can always come back and move them a little bit later. So now for the more exciting part, we're going to add in a plane, pull it above our bed frame mattress here and kind of position it right over it, scale it up a bit, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control R and add a bunch of edge loops using the mouse wheel to add more. And this is going to be the blanket, if you couldn't guess already. So I'm just switching on proportional editing mode there on top and pulling the blanket up and around, because when I simulate this using a cloth simulation, I want it to fall naturally and look like it has all kinds of natural wrinkles. So by doing this, you can kind of create your mesh in mid-air, as you see I'm doing here, and then you can simulate it with the Blender cloth simulation. So just going ahead and kind of creating that flap there and then adding a few more edge loops. So now I'm going to set up the cloth simulation. So we're going to go to our physics tab on the bottom there in Blender and add in a cloth simulation. Now I really didn't have to change much of the default settings for the cloth simulation. Mostly you just want to go down to collision and make sure you turn on self collision. So when the fabric falls, it's falling onto itself and colliding with itself, and it looks a lot more realistic. So you can see when I play it here, it falls right through the mattress, and that's because we need to go to the physics tab again and add a collision object for our mattress. So go ahead and do that. The only setting I changed here is the friction on the collision physics setting, and that just makes it so the fabric doesn't slide on the mattress too much. So I'm just going to go ahead and tweak this a little bit more, giving ourselves a little bit more fabric to work with. The more you have falling down on itself, the cooler it's going to look once it's all simulated with the cloth simulator. So here you can see with our first pass is looking pretty cool, but there wasn't enough wrinkles for my liking. So I go through here and add in a few more edge loops and just make our mesh a little bit more wonky. So when it does simulate and fall, there's more wrinkles throughout the cloth. So you can see here in a moment when I simulate it again, we have a much more wrinkled looking simulation and it's looking a lot better. So now I'm just going to go ahead and shade that smooth and then add in a solidify modifier. And this is to give our cloth a little bit of thickness to make it look a little bit more like a quilt. I kept these settings pretty low. As you can see, it got really messy if you go too high, but staying with a very low value and playing around with the offset until you get a nice looking mesh is all you have to do. And there we have it, a very nice looking quilt. So up next, we're going to go ahead and pick a frame that looks best in the simulation, apply the subsurf, and then apply the cloth simulator. Once those are applied, we can go ahead and add a multi-resolution modifier. This is going to allow us to do a little bit of sculpting on our fabric here to take it a notch further and add a few wrinkles that we couldn't really get in the cloth simulator. So I do a bit of quick sculpting here, just using the basic sculpt brush, nothing too fancy. I'm not great at sculpting myself, but as long as you go ahead and add some wrinkles, it's always going to look better, I think. And then I'm just going to grab the smooth brush here and smooth those wrinkles out until they look a bit more natural. And yeah, if you're not happy with the wrinkle, you can always just kind of smooth it out until it looks more natural. Something like that just gives it a little bit more detail that I thought looked pretty good. So that's going to do it for the cloth. Now it's time for some pillows. For these, I just used a basic cube scaled down to approximately the right size of a pillow. And we're going to go ahead and throw a few more subdivisions into here. So tab into edit mode here and add some edge loops on every axis so we have something to work with. And then I'm going to grab the corners and just scale them out a little bit so we have a little bit more of a pillow shape. Again, doing some quick sculpting over in the sculpt mode, just using the sculpt brush and the smooth tool. Again, I am not great at sculpting, as you can see, but it doesn't take an expert sculptor to do a pillow, and all you have to do is just keep kind of playing around with it until you get something that looks something like a pillow. And as you can see, I end up with something that looks pretty decent here, and then again, a few wrinkles with the sculpt brush, and then you smooth them out until they look decent. Nothing too fancy, but it got the job done, and it's not even that visible in the camera, so you don't have to worry too much. And then once you have one object, you don't have to bother sculpting all other four. You can just duplicate them, changing the rotation and position, and get by with just basically doing the sculpting on a single pillow. So just scaling and positioning these pillows in place until we have a scene that looks somewhat natural, like they're sitting on top of the mattress there. And we're ready to move on. So now that we have our main subject, I'm going to go over to our environment settings and start setting up some environment lighting. So I changed it to environment texture there in the environment settings, and then just opening up a new window here and switching to the shader editor, and then switching to the world settings up on top there. We can go ahead and open up an HDR for our environment lighting. Now I'm going to go ahead and quickly drop in a mapping and an input texture coordinate node. This is going to allow me to change the rotation of our HDR so we can have whatever we want positioned behind our scene in the window there. Then you can just rotate it along the Z axis until you find some nice trees for the background there. I think I settled on a 18 rotation. So now we're going to go ahead and enable a few EEVEE features, starting with ambient occlusion. This is just to kind of set up the scene a little bit so it's a little prettier to work in. I find as long as you're working in real time, you might as well make it look good while you do it. So using ambient occlusion and making sure that bent normals and bounces approximation are both enabled, as they both improve the ambient occlusion, and then go ahead and enable screen space reflections. This is going to add some reflections to our scene and help objects to interact with each other. Going down, we have the indirect lighting. So to use indirect lighting in EEVEE, we need to first add in a light probe and an irradiance volume. At the bottom there, we're going to add that in and we're going to scale it up so it is consuming the entire scene. You want it to be just a bit bigger than your walls, so it's completely consuming the entire scene, everything that's visible to the camera essentially. And we're just going to scale it along the X, Y, and Z axis until it's fitting our little modern room here nicely. And what this is going to do is essentially bake some indirect lighting into our scene, making the HDR interact with our scene. So just clicking bake indirect lighting there in the EEVEE settings, you can see we get all kinds of shadows and stuff coming from that HDR now interacting with our objects. If you do end up with a little bit of the light bleed that you see up in the corners, sometimes just adding a little bit of thickness to your walls will fix that, or upping the resolution of the irradiance volume in the settings there can also improve the light bleed effect you sometimes get. Alright, so moving on, we're going to go ahead and add some lights to our scene. We're starting with an area lamp, and this is going to be sort of the edge lighting that you have around that drop ceiling. So this is really cool. In real life, it's probably done with like LEDs or something, but what we're going to be using is an area lamp, and we're just scaling it down so it fits right along the edge of that drop ceiling that we put in there. Placing it right on that edge, you can see you get that light kind of streaming down on the wall, and it gives a really cool modern effect. I'm just going to go to the settings here on that area lamp and take the strength down to 1.5 and give it a little bit of a reddish hue. And you're going to want to enable contact shadows as well in the shadow settings. You can also customize how far the light travels using the custom distance feature there, which can be handy if a light is hitting something that you don't really want, you can adjust it there. So here I'm just going to go through and duplicate these for all three sides of our room here, so it looks like it's kind of surrounding the interior. And if I take a look inside here, you can see that we have some nice lighting throughout our room. So that's the start of it. So next up, we're going to go Shift S and add the cursor to the center of our scene, where we can add a plane and scale that up to be the bottom sort of rug that goes underneath the bed here. So I'm just scaling it up right above the floor here. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn off our rendered view so we can work just in the OpenGL port here. Now scrolling down to the particle settings, we're going to go ahead and add a new particle system. We're going to change this particle system over to hair. We're going to choose advanced, and we're going to give ourselves a very short hair length. So I'm going to take it way down to about a 0.02. All the way down to about a 0.02, and then you can go ahead and increase the hair amount to 10,000. I actually ended up going to about 4,000 in the end, but you can create as many as you want depending on what your system can handle. So now down into the physics settings, we're going to give it a little bit of a Brownian motion. That just helps to give it a little bit of a random look. Now we're going to go down to our children settings, choose simple, and we're going to take away the radius amount. We're going to give it a length of 1. I'm going to give it a roundness setting of 0, and then a little bit of radius so the hairs kind of separate from that master particle. The child kind of surrounds the master particles there. Now you can play around with the hair length to find out what works exactly for your scene, as it always will be a little bit different for you. But I found a 0.05 is what I settled on. Now you're going to go up to your settings and choose particle edit. And in the comb settings here, you can change your strength and your brush size. But I'm just going to go ahead and comb this carpet, because no carpet has its hair sticking straight up. Even if it's a really fluffy carpet, the hairs on that carpet usually kind of flap down as they're walked down and stuff. So here I'm just going around and kind of combing those hairs down to look like they've been stepped on and kind of brushed around and stuff. No hair ever stands straight up. So this is a way to give it kind of that natural brushed look. Now I'm just going to give it a basic principled shader material. And to render it well in cycles, we're going to go back to our EEVEE settings down to hair. And you want to change the hair shape type to strip. This gives you the best results when rendering within EEVEE, as you can see here. And with that set to strip, you can give it a subdivision of 1 as well. We're going to go back to our hair settings in our particle tab, and we're going to give those a bit of shape. So scrolling all the way down to hair shape, you can change the hair shape settings so it looks a little bit more like rug fur. And so what I found looks the best is taking the strand shape down to a -1 and taking the radius root to about a 0.1, with the tip being a 0.01, so even smaller than the radius, and the radius scaling down to a 0.01 as well. I thought it gave it the best sort of hairy rug look. Now switching over to rendered view, you can see that the particles are rendering when we're rendering it within EEVEE. So with our material settings here, I'm going to give it a roughness value of about a 0.8, as it shouldn't be too shiny. And then I'm going to go over to our particle settings and make sure that it's using the right material in the render settings. And you can choose it to show the emitter or not there if you want. But you can see that I have it set up to use material 1, and it is using that material. You can give it a little bit of sheen, as a little bit of overall shininess on the hair strands are okay. And give it the brightest base color possible. Here you can see that it looks a little bit better without the closed tip, so you can go ahead and turn that off. So the next step for me was to start adding in some materials so we can kind of see how it's going to look in our lighting here. First off, I always enable Node Wrangler in the user preferences here, as it makes working with materials, even in EEVEE, way faster. So using our principled shader here, I'm going to add the floor first. You have to make sure it's unwrapped by grabbing the mesh and just hitting U and unwrap. It's a very basic plane, so it unwraps very easily. Now we're just going to add in an image texture, and I'm using a wood floor texture from textures.com, I believe, and I will include links to all these textures in the description. Here I'm just rotating the UV map so the wood is going in the direction I want for my floor, and then scaling it up so it looks about a nice scale for the scene, watching the corners so you don't have any of those real thin pieces of wood hitting the corners. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and assign a blank principled shader to the walls for now. So I'm going to go through the process now of setting up a basic PBR material using the textures, like I said, from texture.com. I'll link to it in the description. And I'm just going ahead and opening the roughness and normal image textures here. For the normal, you're going to go ahead and add a vector normal map, connect that to the color, and then a vector bump node, and you can connect the normal to the normal, and then the bump to the normal on your principled shader. And then take the strength down a bit, as by default I thought it was way too strong, so I took it down to about a 0.1, as you don't want too much bump on your floor. Adding in one more texture, we can use the displace texture right into the height socket on the bump node, and again take that way down. I went to a 0.03. So what I like to also do here is add in a color mix node and put that on the roughness material, or texture I should say, and this way I can kind of control how much roughness there is and how much glossiness you end up in your material. For this, I'm just mixing it with a gray material, and then you can choose how much you want of the roughness by changing the factor there. To finish off this texture then, I'm just going to go ahead and add in the AO image that came along with this PBR material from textures.com. And to do this, you're basically just going to use a color mix RGB, you're going to switch it to multiply and multiply the AO into the bottom socket, and then change the factor all the way up to 1 if you want full AO. You can see here that it's a slight difference, but it does improve the material a little bit, so you might as well add it in. So now for that marble wall behind the bed, we're just going to scale up the UV map a bit so we have it tiled nicely across our texture, and then you can go ahead and tweak the UV map here so you don't have any stretching textures due to it being a rectangle, as you can see here. Now, I didn't bother showing how to set up the PBR material a second time for the marble, as it's basically the same thing as the wood floor, maybe just a little bit more shiny and a little bit more bump. But besides that, it's basically the exact same PBR material I just set up for the wood. But what I do want to show you here is how I added that overlaying bump texture to the marble wall there. And that was done using a input texture, brick texture. So just go ahead and add in the brick texture node there. And this is actually a really powerful node that I haven't really played with that much, but it's really cool. I'm gonna go ahead and quickly add in the texture coordinate and mapping node again for this texture so we can control the vector mapping on it. But you can see here we end up with a brick texture. So you can see by changing the scale factor here, you can really play around with the size of the bricks. I think I settled on about a 0.4 there. And then going down to the mortar size, you want to go for a pretty small value on this, as this is going to be really what is adding the bump to the scene. And then with the bias setting, you want to set that to 1 so we don't have any color variation, as we want the bump to be consistent across our whole object. Now you can see you can also play with the row height and width. I think I pretty much went with the default settings. And then you want to tweak the location on your mapping node to make sure that the bricks are kind of fitting the scene nicely. And with that done, all we have to do is take that and connect it to the height output on our bump node, and you can see we have the brick overlay there controlling the bump. Of course, I have to make the mortar size a bit smaller. I went with a 0.08, and then you can boost the strength up a bit on your bump node, and you end up with that nice brick overlay that I thought looked pretty cool. So now, instead of modeling every individual asset to kind of fill out the scene, I decided that I would check out to see if CG Trader had any assets that would work well for this site. And it turns out they have a large selection of 3D models that you can use in your scenes. And if you want to just try it out, you can even just search by free, and they have tons of free options. So if you guys want to follow along exactly with this tutorial, you can go ahead and download the chair model that I used right there. So when you're working on a modern interior, or any interior for that matter, using a few pre-made assets can really speed up your workflow and fill out a scene to make it look a lot more realistic. So I'm just going ahead and downloading this chair that you see here, and then jumping over to Blender, you can just go up to your file, import, and you're going to choose wavefront.obj. Depending on the object you downloaded in the format, you'll want to choose whatever format you downloaded it in. And then I'm just scaling down this pre-made asset that is our chair and rotating it around into our corner, getting about the scale that looks right and the angle that I think will look well for the camera. So now I'm going to go ahead here and drop in a few materials on that pre-made asset, just switching to rendered view so I can kind of see how it's going here, and adding in a new material for the legs. I give it kind of a shiny black metal material. Basically, it's just using the principled shader with a little bit of roughness added. And then I'm going to add in a second material for the chair seat. Just grab it and assign it to that new white material. And that's basically it. A little bit of details that I found looked cool is to go ahead and select some of those nuts and bolts on the chair asset, and then assign sort of a silver material to that. And that just gives it even more detail and makes it look even more realistic in my opinion. But at this point, you might be noticing when you bake your indirect lighting that is too blue, and that's because we need to kind of tweak our HDR. So here I just dropped in an RGB curves on our environment texture, and you can kind of bring down the light intensity and then also take down the blue values a little bit, as well as the green values, leaving it with a little bit more of a red hue. So now if I jump back to our EEVEE settings and free the lighting cache, you can see that it looks like a much more natural color. And if I go ahead and turn off that RGB curves node, you can see it gets back to being blue. So it looks much better. So now to be able to control the shadows a little bit more in our scene, I went ahead and added an area lamp on the outside of our window, sort of shining in so I can control some of the shadows and lighting highlights on our scene. So jumping over to our area lamp settings, I'm just going to play around with the energy and the color a little bit, going with a reddish hue. I think I found 3 or 4 to work well for the light intensity. So this lamp is just meant mainly to add some more shadows and highlights to the scene. You're going to want to go ahead and get the rotation set up for your liking, and then of course enable contact shadows in the area lamp settings. And I'll go ahead and duplicate this area lamp then for our other window, just making a few changes, making the light intensity a little bit less and giving it a light blue hue. So you can see with that lamp added in, we're getting some nice highlights and shadows added into our scene. If you went ahead and baked the indirect lighting again, you would see some of that in effect. So now it's time for a few more assets in our scene. Again, I got that plant that you saw in the finished render from CG Trader, along with a few other things like the lamp, for example, and they have tons of options, paid and free, depending on what you're looking for. So go ahead and find some assets that you like if you don't feel like modeling everything yourself. If you want to use the exact models that I used, I'll link to them in the description below. They're free to download and you can go ahead and get those. The curtains as well was from CG Trader. Of course, you could simulate these with the cloth simulator in Blender as well, but it saves a little bit of time to grab a pre-made asset. To import a Blender asset, you can just go append, you find the blend file that the asset is in, you go object, and then you just select that mesh object, and voila, you have the curtains in your scene. Here I'm just going to grab them and scale them into position a bit, scaling them up along the Z for a little bit of a narrower curtain is what I went for, and then switching into edit mode and scaling them up along the Z axis so they fit nicely along the wall. I then jumped into edit mode and kind of separated them apart a bit. You do want it covering the window somewhat, but you also want to be able to let some of the light in. So I found something like that looked pretty nice. For the curtain material, it's just a basic principled shader made a bit darker in the base color and then turning down the specularity quite a bit, giving it a little bit of sheen if you feel like it. And then you can go ahead and drop in a mix shader, and I'm going to add in a translucent shader. Now for whatever reason, when you hit Shift A, the translucent shader was not showing up, but if you go over to your materials on the right here, you can go ahead and change the surface to translucent, and as you can see, it changes that then over in our node editor, of course. And now you can just use that translucent shader with a mix shader. It might be a bug right now, I don't know, but If you want to get the translucent, that seemed to be the only option right now. So using a mix shader with the principled in the top and the translucent in the bottom, you can see that we let some light through on our curtains and it makes it look a lot more realistic. You want to turn the factor on the mix shader down to about a 0.15 to give it just a little bit of that effect, but I thought it looked pretty nice. So now we're going to add a little bit of bump to our curtains just to give it sort of that fabric look. So to do that, it's just a basic noise texture, and we're going to take the scale way up to about a value of 400, and we're also going to give it some detail, like a 6 or something will work nice. Then we're going to go ahead and drop in a color ramp node, and this is going to be to kind of control the amount of bump that we want in our scene. So go ahead and connect the color of the noise texture to our color ramp. And if you take a look at what that color ramp looks like now, you can see we have that texture across our model. So I'm just pulling in the black values here a little bit to give ourselves a more contrasty sort of noise texture. And I'm going to take the value to be a little less black to turn the intensity down a little bit. So now I just added in a bump node, dropping this into the normal socket on our principled shader, and then connecting the color ramp to the height. And if you take a look at what I have here, you can see we have a very strong bump overlay on our curtains. And that's exactly what I'm looking for once you take the strength down to about a 0.2 or even less. And I found it looked a little bit better inverted as well. But you can play around with the strength and the color settings here until you get a bump that is desired, but I gave it a much more realistic look to the curtains in my opinion. It's sort of one of those subtle effects, but it definitely improved the overall scene. And now for the blanket on the bed is basically the same material as the curtains, minus the translucency, and then I just took the color to be more of a dark blue and gave it even more roughness so you don't have any reflections on this quilt. Using the same bump node though to kind of give it that texture, and yeah, taking down the reflections just a little bit so it's a nice flat material. The one thing I'm going to do here now though is add in a image texture, and this is actually a normal map. Again, it'll be linked to in the description, but this is a normal map that contains some wrinkles. It was from textures.com, and using this as a normal map to our quilt gave it some more of that fine wrinkle detail. So opening up that normal map and then plugging it into, again, a converter normal map node, using it as the color, this gave us even more wrinkles, fine detail I would say in the wrinkles that made it look even more realistic, and a little bit of detail through the texture always helps. So you can see here that we have some extra wrinkles now across our scene. So adding in a texture and a mapping node, you can go ahead and crank the values up on the X and Y on the scale and kind of tile that even more. I think I went with a 2. And this just gives you even more of those fine wrinkles spread across your quilt, and I thought it looked pretty cool. You can see the normal map has a few little issues on it, so I had to turn the strength down a little bit, something like a 0.6 I think. Looked pretty good. And for the pillows, it was basically the same material, just a few more noise textures plugged into color ramps to add some of that fine little bump that you get on a fabric, just to kind of fake a fabric look, and I thought it looked pretty well. So now I go ahead and set up some of those hanging lamps that I think looked really cool and add a lot to the scene. I just do this by adding a circle, turning the vertice count down to about 12, extruding it and pulling it down towards the bed, and then grabbing the whole mesh and scaling it along the Shift Z axis to only scale it along the Shift Z, making it nice and thin there. Then I just grab that edge loop and scale it up a bit bigger, extruding it down to give ourselves a sort of light bulb effect. This doesn't really have to be too detailed. I just went ahead and scaled it up a little bit above it, then added in a few materials, starting with another black glossy material like I did earlier for the chair, making it nice and shiny by turning the roughness value down a little bit, and then going ahead and shading it smooth. And here I add in another material, and this is going to be the emissive material for that light bulb. So going ahead and selecting the entire light bulb there by enabling the limit selection option, and then assigning a emission shader to that material. I think I cranked this up to about a strength of 15 and give it a nice warm look. Then I just added an icosphere over the entire light bulb socket, putting it right over it, and then adding a new material to that icosphere. So for this icosphere material, we're going to create a very simple glass shader. So I'm going to delete the principled shader and add in a glass shader, a mix shader, and a transparent shader. The transparent shader is just connected to the bottom, while the glass to the top, and then it's controlled with a factor of the Fresnel node. So very simple glass shader here. And the real magic comes now when you go over to the material settings on the right here and choose multiply as the blend mode, and then enabling screen space reflection on that as well. So this really gives you some cool light effects with the space reflections. Now I'm just adding in a light lamp and making it a point lamp. You can see the strength is way too strong right now. Just taking down the energy settings and the radius as well a bit. Now I just go ahead here and give that lamp a bit of a nice warm material, so we have a nice sort of incandescent looking bulb hanging right there above our bed, and I thought that looked pretty cool. So now I just grab the bulb and the lamp and go ahead and duplicate this across the scene. I think I added a total of 6 of these bulbs in, just kind of on both sides of the bed. These hanging bulbs really gave it that modern look that I thought looked really cool. And now you can see that they don't really pop until you go to your EEVEE settings and choose bloom. And this is where the bloom setting really looks cool in EEVEE. Of course, you're going to have to take the threshold down until you're not getting any of the glow on the pillows or anything, but only on the light bulbs. And you can give it a little bit of color as well. So here I wanted to show you how I set up the lighting for that little lamp that I showed you guys on CG Trader. To do this, it was just, again, a simple point lamp, and you place it right at the end of the light bulb. I'm going to take the strength down to about a 0.8 or so, again giving it a little bit of a warm hue. And then what you're going to do to really make these shadows come out though is take the radius down a bit, and you can see we're getting some more shadows once that's turned down. Of course, you also have to remember to enable contact shadows, as that makes it look even cooler. And just like before, you can also use custom distance. If you don't want the light to travel too far, you can take it down to something like a 4 or 5. I found this nice to kind of control what was lit and what wasn't. Now to really give the shadow behind the lamp, you have to turn the clip start down on the shadow. So turning this way down to like a 0.04 gives you a nice shadow behind the wall being cast by the shade on the lamp, and it just gave it a nicer looking effect, as you can see here. So this is a way to kind of control the shadows and get the lighting that you're looking for within EEVEE. So you can go ahead and finish out your scene now with some trim around the bottom of the walls. That was a nice little detail, as well as some trim around the windows will look nice. But here I want to show you guys how to add that mirror that was in the back of the scene, as this kind of uses some of the different EEVEE features that allows you to add reflections to your scene like this. So I'm just using a basic cube scaled up as a rectangular, sort of as a stand-up mirror, and then tabbing into edit mode, I grabbed the edges of the mirror, just extruding them out and scaling them along the Z and the X axis, giving myself sort of a frame to this mirror that I could give a different material to. Then I'm going to grab that center face and jump to wireframe and delete the face behind it, as I only want one pane on this mirror. Then you can just jump back to the look dev here and move your mirror up until it's sitting nicely on the floor. Now I'm just going to select the whole mesh and do a quick smart UV project, so I can grab that wood material that we actually made for the floor and just use that same material as the wood framing on this mirror. Nothing crazy. You can tweak it a little bit if you wanted to, but it's just a simple wood material. I'm going to add another material here though, and this is for the glass pane on the mirror. So just creating a new material for that mirror face, grabbing that center face and assigning the new material to it. Now I'm going to jump over to the node editor here, guys, and I'm using just a basic glass shader just like we did before, except now I'm adding in another mix shader, making it glossy and changing it to sharp. This is going to give us some of that sharp reflections, taking the roughness way down to about a 0.07, plugging that glossy shader into the bottom of the mix shader. You can see we get a nice sharp reflection in our mirror, and you can change the color by making it a little bit darker. Jumping over to our settings then, on the right, we're going to go ahead and choose the blend mode to be alpha blend, and this really gets the transparency working on that material. As you can see now, it looks a lot more transparent. Then we're going to choose screen space reflection. You want to uncheck show back faces, it's not necessary. So the material's set up, but now it's time to add those reflections. So I'm going to add a light probe, and this time it's going to be a reflection plane. We're going to rotate this along the Z axis and along the X axis, scaling it down to fit right within that mirror glass that we created. And then you're going to want to move it just behind the mirror glass. So grabbing it and pushing it back so it's just behind that glass material. And then if we switched over to a rendered view, you can see what the reflection plane is doing. If I was to move my camera around here, you can see that we get the reflections of the scene in that mirror, and it's looking really cool. So now if we grab that mirror along with the reflection plane and just kind of move it around our scene, you can see that in real time it's reflecting the scene within that mirror. This was my first time using the reflection planes in EEVEE, and I thought it was pretty cool. But the one thing is, the reflection mirror is just showing you what it's seeing but not actually what it's rendering. So you can see here, if I change the overlays to be off, we really don't have any reflection, and that would be our final render. So what we have to do to fix that is grab our reflection plane and change a few of the settings on it. So going over to our right sidebar there, down to our reflection plane settings, you want to increase the distance to be much higher. And now you can see that we actually have our scene reflecting even with those overlays turned off. You can play around with fall off settings a little bit if you want. I found just leaving them at 0.5 was all you really had to do, and that's about it. So we had a cool looking mirror in our scene using a reflection plane. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add some volume to our scene. So you want to make sure that in your EEVEE settings you have volumetric enabled, volumetric lighting, and volumetric shadows. With those enabled, we can go ahead and open up a node editor here and bring up our world settings. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a new shader here, and this is going to be the principled volume shader. So this is a pretty new shader to Blender, and it's really cool. It's a all-in-one shader basically for smoke and volumetric settings. So you can see with the default settings, it's way too strong, but if I take the density down to about a 0.1, it adds some of that nice ambient fog to the air, which makes it look a little bit more realistic, as it's sort of like dust or something in the air. And then I like to take the anastrophe down to about a negative 0.5, as I found that looked the best. The black body intensity could go all the way up, as I thought that looked the best with it all the way up as well. And then the color needs to be a little bit darker and slightly blue, as I thought that looked pretty cool for the scene, but you can play around with the colors, of course. And now to turn down the intensity of that volumetric lighting on your HDR environment, you can go over to your EEVEE settings, into your volumetric settings, and change the end point to that volumetric. You can see when it's really high, the window is like blocked out by that volumetric lighting, but if you take it down to something like a 15 or a 20, you have much more detail outside that window now, as the volumetric lighting is a lot less strong. So the last thing I wanted to mention here now was if your scene is looking kind of dark, you might have to up the exposure a bit over in your color management settings. I think I left mine around an exposure of a 1.5 to a 2, as this just brings up the light a little bit. And then you can also give yourself a little bit of a medium high contrast look, of course using the filmic preset in our render settings there. And that just gave me the best looking results, I thought. So that's going to do it, guys, for our modern interior tutorial done in EEVEE. I hope you guys have had fun following along with this tutorial and learned some new things about EEVEE. As you can see, it's super cool, as this is all being done in real time. And I had a lot of fun making this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'd like to again thank CG Trader for sponsoring this video. Definitely check them out with the link in the description. And I'll see you in my next video, guys. Bye!